The sky was the color of steel, heavy and merciless. The snow did not fall softly that night. It slashed sideways, carried by winds that howled like wolves through the narrow valley. It was the kind of cold that burned the skin, the kind of cold that could freeze a river solid overnight. And in that brutal winter, when the thermometer read -20 degrees Celsius, a young woman stood trembling on the edge of an ice-covered lake, her breath rising in frantic clouds. Her name was Valentina Carter. 7 months pregnant, her belly curved beneath her thin wool coat, a coat far too fragile for a night like this. She clutched it shut with both hands, as if holding herself together could keep out the cold. Her face was pale, lips cracked, her eyes wide with fear and disbelief. Behind her stood her husband, Richard Carter, tall, broad-shouldered, his voice sharp as the wind that cut across the frozen water. "Get in," he barked. "Show me you're not useless. Prove you can still obey." The words sliced deeper than the cold. Valentina's heart pounded against her ribs. Her unborn child kicked inside her, as if begging her not to take another step. She shook her head, desperate tears freezing against her lashes. "Richard, please," she whispered. I can't, the baby." But Richard's hand clamped down on her shoulder, his grip iron, his eyes blazing with anger and pride. "Don't use that baby as an excuse. You think you're fragile? You're not. Get in the water, Valentina, now." The small crowd that had gathered on the snowy bank gasped. They had seen arguments before, married couples clashing in the bitter winters of their little town, but this was different. This was cruelty unfolding in the open, cruelty directed at a woman who was visibly vulnerable. Among the onlookers was David Collins, the town's only doctor. His jaw tightened as he stepped forward. "Richard, stop this madness," he shouted over the wind. "She's pregnant. You'll kill her and the baby." But Richard only sneered. "Mind your own business, doctor. My wife belongs to me. She'll do as I say." Valentina's legs shook, her boots slipping slightly on the ice. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body felt locked in place by fear and exhaustion. This was not the man she thought she had married. The Richard she fell in love with once made her laugh with silly jokes, once kissed her hands when she cried after work, once promised to protect her no matter what. That man was gone, replaced by someone colder than the winter night itself. The villagers whispered, their voices trembling with disbelief. "He's gone too far," an old woman muttered. "Forcing her into the lake in this weather, with child?" But no one dared step closer. Richard was powerful in his arrogance, and fear of him hung in the air. Valentina's tears turned into tiny crystals on her cheeks. She looked at Richard, hoping to find even the smallest trace of mercy, but saw none. His eyes were locked on her with cruel expectation, as if her obedience was a stage for his pride. And then it struck her. This wasn't just about control. This was about humiliation. Richard wanted the world to see her as weak, desperate, and broken. The ice beneath her cracked faintly, a sound sharp as glass. Panic rushed through her veins. She turned back to him, her voice breaking. "Richard, I'm begging you. Please. If not for me, then for our child." His lips curled into a cruel smile. "Our child? Do you think that baby will save you? Get in, Valentina." For a moment the whole world seemed to hold its breath. Even the wind paused, as if nature itself was watching. Then with a shove, Richard forced her forward. Valentina's cry pierced the night as her body plunged through the thin layer of ice into the black, freezing water below. Gasps erupted from the crowd. Some women screamed. David rushed forward, but Richard blocked him with a raised arm. "She'll survive," Richard said coldly. "She needs to learn her place." Under the ice, the cold slammed into Valentina like 1,000 knives. Her lungs seized, her body convulsed. She clawed her way upward, her hands bloody from the jagged ice as she tried to break through the surface. Her baby shifted violently inside her belly, and terror gripped her heart. Would this be the end for both of them? David shouted again, his voice raw. "She's drowning! Get her out now!" For a terrifying moment, no one moved. The crowd stood frozen, paralyzed by the horror of what they were witnessing. Richard's shadow loomed over the broken ice, his face unreadable. He had wanted to see fear, and now he saw it in its purest form. But instead of reaching down to save her, he folded his arms. And then, with one final desperate strike, Valentina broke the surface, gasping for air, her fingers clinging to the sharp rim of the ice hole. Her sobs tore through the night. The doctor threw off his coat. pushing past Richard, diving to his knees, and hauling her out with every ounce of his strength. She collapsed into his arms, shivering violently, her lips blue, her breath shallow. The villagers surged forward now, outrage replacing their fear. He could have killed her. A pregnant woman, for God's sake. Richard Carter, you're a monster. But Richard didn't flinch. He simply smirked at his wife lying in another man's arms. If she can't handle a little cold, maybe she's not strong enough to be my wife. That single sentence hung in the air like poison. It was the moment everything shattered. The trust, the love, the illusion of safety. Valentina's heart cracked open as the truth burned in her chest. This man would never protect her. This man would rather watch her die than give her kindness. And as David carried her away through the snow, wrapping his own coat tightly around her trembling body, Valentina knew one thing with absolute certainty. This night would change everything. Because sometimes, survival itself is the first act of rebellion. And tonight, Valentina survived. She would never belong to Richard Carter again. Before the freezing night that would scar her forever. Valentina Carter was known as the kind of woman people in town trusted without hesitation. She wasn't glamorous or wealthy, not the kind of person who drew attention when she entered a room. Instead, she carried herself with quiet dignity, the kind that made children smile and elders feel respected. At 28, Valentina worked as a schoolteacher in the small mountain town of Grayford. Her classroom was a modest one, with cracked chalkboards and desks that bore decades of carved initials. Yet to her, it was a sacred place. She taught her students not only how to read and write, but also how to believe in themselves. When a boy came to class with holes in his shoes, she would secretly slip a pair of warm socks into his backpack. When a girl struggled with arithmetic, she would stay long after the bell rang, patiently guiding her through numbers until the tears disappeared from the child's eyes. Her salary barely covered rent and groceries, yet she gave more of herself than anyone else could see. That was who Valentina was, someone who poured love into every crack the world left behind. And when she met Richard Carter, she believed she had found someone who would finally pour love back into her. Richard was everything she thought she wanted in a man. Charming, ambitious, confident. He swept her off her feet quickly, promising her a life of security after years of struggling. They married within a year. She had been so certain she was stepping into a partnership built on respect. What she didn't know was that her vow would be the start of her undoing. At first, life with Richard wasn't unbearable. He liked to show her off when they went into town, bragging about how lucky he was to marry such a beautiful schoolteacher. He would kiss her cheek in public and call her his sweet Val. But behind closed doors, his words often carried sharp edges. "You don't understand real ambition," he would scoff when she asked about his late nights. "You're too soft, Valentina. That's why people walk all over you. Do you even know how hard it is for me to carry this family while you waste your time teaching brats for pennies?" Each comment chipped away at her confidence, but Valentina stayed silent. She told herself he was under pressure, that he would change once the baby arrived, that his cruelty was only temporary. She clung to the memory of the man she had first loved, the one who used to bring her wildflowers after work. Then came the pregnancy. When Valentina discovered she was expecting, her heart swelled with hope. She imagined the baby as the glue that might hold their marriage together, the miracle that would soften Richard's temper. She decorated the tiny nursery with second-hand furniture, painting the crib by herself until her hands blistered. She sewed little blankets late at night, humming lullabies her mother used to sing. But instead of tender joy, Richard grew colder. He complained about the cost of baby supplies, mocked her morning sickness, and accused her of using pregnancy as an excuse to rest. "Don't think you get a free pass just because you're carrying a baby," he said one morning, slamming his coffee cup down. She never argued. Instead, she carried the weight of his words alone, burying her pain under gentle smiles whenever neighbors asked how she was doing. What people didn't see was the depth of Valentina's loneliness. Her parents had died years earlier in a car accident, and she had no siblings to lean on. Richard was supposed to be her family, her protector. Instead, he became her tormentor. Still, she kept going. Every day she walked to school despite the icy roads, her breath fogging in the air, her swollen belly slowing her steps. Her students became her anchor. Their laughter reminded her that kindness still mattered, even if her own home was filled with cold silence. At night, she would press her hands against her belly and whisper, "I'll keep you safe, I promise." It was a vow spoken in the dark, a vow she prayed she could keep even when Richard's anger grew unpredictable. One evening, after she prepared a simple dinner of soup and bread, Richard arrived home with the faint smell of perfume that wasn't hers. When she asked about it, his laugh was cruel. "Don't start, Valentina. You're not exactly irresistible these days." Her heart sank, but she said nothing. She simply cleared the table, washed the dishes, and tucked herself into bed with tears she didn't let him see. She had heard whispers in town about Vanessa Moore, the wealthy daughter of a businessman who often lingered around Richard. But Valentina forced herself to believe they were only rumors. She told herself that if she endured a little longer, everything would get better. What she didn't realize was that her silence was giving Richard more power. By the time winter tightened its icy grip on Grayford, Richard had grown reckless with his cruelty. He would criticize her in front of neighbors, call her weak, laugh at her struggles. Still, she endured, because she believed walking away wasn't an option. She thought she had nowhere to go. But fate has a way of testing those who suffer quietly. And Valentina's test came the night Richard led her to the frozen lake, demanding she step into the water. In that moment, everything about her life, the sacrifices, the heartbreak, the silent prayers, collided with brutal clarity. She was no longer just a wife, she was a mother fighting for her child. And though she survived that night, shivering in the arms of David Collins, a truth began to spark deep inside her. Endurance was no longer enough. For the first time in her life, Valentina realized she would have to choose between obedience and survival. And survival meant walking away. She had no idea that leaving Richard would not only save her life, but also uncover secrets that would change everything. Grayford was not the kind of town people passed through on their way to somewhere else. It sat nestled in a narrow valley, hemmed in by towering pine-covered mountains that seemed to scrape the sky. The winters here were legendary, brutal enough to test even the strongest souls. Roads disappeared under feet of snow, roofs groaned under white weight, and the river froze so hard that children could skate across it without fear of breaking through. But beneath the quiet beauty of snow-laden branches and icicle-tipped eaves, Grayford carried something darker, a silence that smothered those who lived there. Everyone knew everyone, and yet, when pain unfolded behind closed doors, people turned away. For Valentina, that silence was both a curse and a prison. She had arrived in Grayford with Richard shortly after their wedding. He had inherited a small cabin from his uncle, perched at the edge of town, where the forest pressed close against the back door. At first, Valentina thought it was charming. Rustic wood beams, a stone fireplace, windows that looked out on endless pines. But as the years passed, the charm faded, replaced by isolation. The cabin was far enough from town that no one could hear if she cried. Grayford's people prided themselves on resilience. They had survived generations of punishing winters, working the mines, logging the forests, and scraping what they could from the frozen earth. Poverty was common, but pride was stronger. Men were judged by their toughness, women by their obedience. And in that harsh code of survival, marriage was sacred, no matter how broken it became. Neighbors whispered about Richard's temper, of course. They saw the way he barked orders at Valentina in the market, the way she flinched when his hand moved too quickly. But they said nothing. In Grayford, interfering in another man's home was considered a betrayal of unwritten rules. "A wife belongs to her husband," the old man muttered around the wood stove at the general store. "She chose him. Now she must endure him." And so the community became complicit. They turned their heads, convincing themselves that what happened inside the Carter cabin was none of their concern. The winter of Valentina's pregnancy was one of the worst the town had seen in decades. Temperatures plunged to -20, sometimes colder. The roads became sheets of glass. Families huddled close to wood stoves, rationing supplies, waiting for spring to bring relief. But inside Valentina's cabin, the cold was more than physical. It seeped into her marriage, freezing out what little warmth had once existed. Each night Richard came home later, often with the scent of whiskey or a trace of perfume lingering on his coat. Each morning he left with harsh words, demanding she chop more wood, shovel the path, or clean until her swollen belly ached. He did not see her as a wife carrying his child. He saw her as a burden, one he had no patience for. The cabin became a cage. And yet Valentina endured, because Greyford offered her nowhere else to go. The town was small, opportunities scarce. She had no living family, no savings, no safety net. Walking away from Richard felt like stepping into a storm without shelter. Still, there were small glimmers of kindness in Greyford, though fragile as candlelight in the wind. David Collins, the town's doctor, often stopped by to check on her under the guise of routine care. He brought her extra vitamins, warm tea, and books for her students. His presence was a reminder that not everyone in Greyford was blind. But even he tread carefully. Confronting Richard meant provoking a man known for his pride and violence. Valentina would stand by the frost-covered window at night, watching the town's faint lights flicker in the distance. She imagined the lives unfolding behind those windows, families gathered around fireplaces, children laughing, couples sharing quiet meals. And then she would look at her own reflection in the glass, pale and weary, and whisper to her unborn child, "One day, we'll be free. I promise." The environment of Greyford magnified everything she suffered. The endless snowstorms mirrored her isolation. The biting winds carried the sting of Richard's words. The frozen river was a cruel metaphor for her life. Trapped under ice, suffocating, desperate for air. It was in this town, under the gaze of silent neighbors and unforgiving mountains, that the unthinkable night at the lake occurred. The setting itself seemed to conspire against her, holding her in place until Richard's cruelty spilled into the open. But Greyford was also a place where secrets could not stay buried forever. Gossip traveled faster than snowmelt in spring, and after that night, whispers about Richard's actions spread through the community like wildfire. Some villagers said Valentina would not survive. Others whispered that the baby was surely lost. Still others murmured that perhaps Richard had gone too far this time, that perhaps Greyford's silence had allowed a monster to grow unchecked. The town that once ignored her pain now found itself haunted by it. And as Valentina lay recovering under David's care, wrapped in blankets, her lips trembling from fever, a storm raged both outside and within. The cabin she once called home no longer existed in her heart. The mountains no longer looked like guardians, they looked like prison walls. Greyford had taken much from her. But it would also be the stage where she reclaimed everything Richard thought he had stolen. Because deep in the valley, where whispers grew louder than the wind, Valentina's story was no longer just hers. It was a mirror for every silent woman watching, waiting, and hoping for the courage to break free. And Richard, proud and arrogant, had no idea that the very town that once protected his silence would soon turn against him. What he did not know was that Valentina's suffering had already planted the seeds of her transformation, and the mountains of Greyford would one day echo not with her cries, but with his downfall. Richard Carter had always been a man who believed he deserved more than what life had given him. In a small mountain town like Greyford, most men were content with a steady job, a warm home, and a family to carry their name. But Richard was not most men. From the time he was a teenager, he dreamed of power, wealth, and recognition. He wanted to be admired, feared, respected, not just another face in the crowd. At 32, Richard cut a striking figure. Tall, broad, with dark hair slicked neatly back, he had the kind of presence that filled a room before he spoke. He knew how to charm when he needed to, how to use his confident smile to win over townsfolk at the bar, or to convince a businessman to trust him with a deal. But behind that smile lay something colder, a hunger that no amount of money or affection could satisfy. For a while, Valentina had believed she was part of his dream. When they first met, Richard had showered her with compliments, telling her she was too good for this small life, that together they would rise above the limitations of Greyford. He promised her stability, a future free from struggle. Valentina, weary from years of surviving alone, wanted to believe him. But Richard's definition of love was control. As soon as the wedding vows were spoken, his mask began to slip. He mocked her modest salary as a teacher, dismissing her job as babysitting. He belittled her simple joys, her books, her knitting, her quiet afternoons. Where she saw meaning, he saw weakness. And when she became pregnant, instead of softening, he grew harsher. To Richard, her pregnancy was not a miracle but a chain. It tied him down to responsibility when what he craved was freedom and status. That was when Vanessa Moore entered the picture. Vanessa was everything Richard thought he wanted. At 26, she was wealthy, bold, and unapologetically ambitious. The daughter of a successful businessman, Vanessa was used to luxury. Silk dresses, glittering jewelry, the hum of expensive cars waiting outside restaurants. She represented the life Richard felt he deserved, not the humble cabin and modest wife he had chosen. The affair began discreetly. Vanessa would invite him to dinners in the city, whispering promises of connections and opportunities. She flattered his ego, telling him he was destined for greatness, that Valentina was holding him back. Richard drank in her words like wine. Each time he returned home smelling faintly of her perfume, his contempt for his wife grew sharper. "You'll never understand what it means to be powerful," he told Valentina one night, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're too small, too ordinary." Valentina lowered her gaze, hiding the tears threatening to spill. She didn't argue. She simply placed a hand on her belly, protecting the child inside. Richard mistook her silence for weakness. With Vanessa's influence, his arrogance swelled. He strutted through town with a confidence that bordered on cruelty. At the tavern, he bragged about business ventures that hadn't yet succeeded. At the market, he treated Valentina like an accessory, snapping at her in front of others. Neighbors noticed, but fear and tradition kept them quiet. Vanessa fueled the fire. "If you want to rise," she whispered, her manicured hand resting on his arm, "you need to rid yourself of dead weight. A man like you doesn't belong with a timid schoolteacher. You belong with someone who can match your ambition." Those words became poison in his mind. Soon, every glance at Valentina felt like a reminder of his own limitations. Instead of seeing her sacrifices, he saw chains. Instead of seeing her devotion, he saw weakness. And with every cruel word, every dismissive gesture, he convinced himself he was justified. By the time winter descended on Greyford, Richard was no longer hiding his disdain. He spoke openly of Vanessa, though not by name, boasting of new opportunities and important people who valued him. He compared Valentina to her, though she didn't know it, saying things like, "Some women know how to be strong. You could learn from them. But cruelty, like ice, has a way of spreading until it cracks the ground beneath it." The night at the frozen lake was not born out of sudden rage. It was the culmination of months of contempt, of a man intoxicated by the belief that he could do anything, that he owned the woman carrying his child. For Richard, forcing Valentina into the icy water was not just punishment, it was performance. It was proof to himself, to Vanessa, and to anyone watching that he was in control, that even nature's fury bowed to his will. What Richard did not anticipate was the reaction of the town. In Greyford, cruelty had always hidden behind walls, but when he pushed his pregnant wife into the freezing lake, he dragged his violence into the open. The villagers who once stayed silent began to whisper. The doctor who once tread carefully now stood against him, and Vanessa, watching from the shadows, began to see not just a man of ambition, but a man unraveling. Yet Richard did not see his downfall coming. That night, after David pulled Valentina from the water, Richard returned home without her. He poured himself a drink by the fire, convinced that she would come crawling back, desperate and broken. He smirked at the thought of her shivering, believing she had no one else to turn to. In his mind, he was still the master of her fate. But what he didn't know was that Valentina was no longer his to control. The woman he had tried to destroy was already beginning to find strength he had never imagined. And the very community that once protected his silence would soon witness his downfall. Richard Carter believed he had everything: power over his wife, the attention of Vanessa, the respect of the town. But arrogance has a way of blinding men to the cracks forming beneath their feet. And when those cracks finally broke, Richard would discover what it felt like to be the one drowning. Because while he saw Valentina as weak, she was already preparing to rise stronger than he ever could. The night of the frozen lake would be remembered in Grayford for decades. Long after the snow melted and the river thawed, people would still whisper about what Richard Carter did to his pregnant wife. It began with a gathering. The townsfolk had come together for the winter festival, a tradition as old as Grayford itself. Every year, families bundled in layers of wool and fur gathered by the lake to light lanterns, drink hot cider, and share stories while the children skated on the thick sheet of ice. It was a celebration of survival, a reminder that even in the coldest season, life endured. Valentina arrived reluctantly, her steps slow on the snow-packed ground. At 7 months pregnant, she should have been resting, but Richard insisted she come. "People need to see us," he said sharply when she hesitated. "I won't have them whispering that my wife is too weak to leave the cabin." She obeyed, as she always had, though her heart pounded with dread. Wrapped in a thin coat, she walked beside him, her breath visible in the night air. Around her, lanterns glowed, laughter echoed, and music drifted from fiddles near the bonfire. But all she felt was the weight of Richard's hand gripping her arm like a shackle. At first, everything seemed normal. Couples twirled on the ice, children tossed snow at one another, and the townsfolk gathered in circles, exchanging news. Richard moved from group to group, flashing his charming smile, speaking loudly about opportunities in the city. He relished the attention, especially when Vanessa Moore appeared, draped in a fur-lined coat that glistened under the lanterns. Her presence made Valentina's stomach twist. Though Richard hadn't admitted the affair, Valentina could feel it in her bones. The way Vanessa's eyes lingered on him, the way Richard's voice softened when he spoke to her, it was enough to carve pain into Valentina's heart. Then, as if the night itself demanded cruelty, Richard raised his voice so all could hear. "My wife," he said, his arm tightening around Valentina's shoulder. "She's been pampered too long. People think she's fragile, but I know better. Tonight, she'll prove her strength." The crowd quieted, curious. Valentina froze. She could feel dozens of eyes turning toward her, waiting. Richard gestured toward the lake, where the surface shimmered under the moonlight. "Valentina will show everyone that she is not weak. She will step into the water, even at 20 below, and she will endure. That's what it means to be my wife." Gasps spread through the crowd. A murmur rose, disbelief crackling in the air. "She's pregnant." Someone whispered, "Surely he's joking," another muttered. But Richard's eyes were cold, his jaw set. He wasn't joking. Valentina's heart thudded in her chest. "Richard, please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I can't. The baby." He cut her off, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "The baby is fine. Stop using it as an excuse. Step onto the ice, Valentina. Show them you are worthy." The silence that followed was suffocating. No one moved, no one spoke. The fire crackled in the distance, the fiddles stopped, even the wind seemed to hold its breath. And then, slowly, Richard shoved her forward. Valentina stumbled toward the lake, her boots slipping on the hard-packed snow. She shook her head desperately, tears freezing on her lashes. "Don't make me do this." But his hand pressed against her back, unyielding. "Do it," he hissed, "or prove to everyone you're nothing but a weak, pathetic burden." The crowd erupted. Some pleaded, "Richard, stop." Others covered their mouths in horror. But no one stepped forward. Grayford's unspoken rule, that a wife belonged to her husband, held them back, paralyzing them in the face of cruelty. Only David Collins, the doctor, broke through the line. "Enough," he shouted, his breath steaming in the cold. "She's carrying a child, Richard. You'll kill them both." Richard turned on him, his glare sharp as a blade. "Stay out of this, Collins. You're nothing but a busybody doctor. This is my wife. She does as I say." The villagers murmured nervously, torn between outrage and fear. David clenched his fists but held his ground, his eyes locked on Valentina's trembling figure, silently willing her to hold on. And then it happened. With a sudden brutal shove, Richard pushed her onto the ice. She landed with a cry, her knees scraping against the frozen surface. Pain shot through her belly, and terror gripped her as the baby shifted violently inside. She scrambled to her feet, desperate to escape, but Richard was already behind her. "Go on," he sneered. "Prove yourself." The ice cracked beneath her boots, a sharp sound that silenced the crowd. Her breath came in frantic gasps. She shook her head, begging, but Richard's eyes burned with merciless pride. And then he shoved her again. The surface gave way. The lake swallowed her whole. The crowd screamed. Gasps filled the night air as the freezing black water closed over Valentina's body. For a moment, the only sound was the roar of the wind and the muffled thuds of her hands pounding against the ice from below. David lunged forward, sprinting onto the ice. "Hold on, Valentina," he shouted, his voice raw with desperation. The villagers rushed closer, panic spreading like wildfire. Some cried out in horror, others covered their children's eyes. But Richard stood still, arms crossed, watching as if it were a test of endurance rather than a fight for survival. Under the water, Valentina's lungs burned. The cold pierced her like 1,000 knives. She clawed upward, searching for air, her hands bloodying against the jagged ice. The baby inside her twisted violently as if fighting alongside her. In her mind, one thought echoed, "I can't die. I won't let him take both of us." David reached her just as her strength was failing. Slamming his fists against the ice, he broke through, plunging his arms into the freezing water. "Valentina, take my hand," he cried. Her fingers found his, weak and trembling, and with a roar of effort, he pulled her out, dragging her onto the ice. She collapsed against him, her lips blue, her body shivering uncontrollably. The villagers crowded around now, outrage spilling over their fear. She could have died. She's carrying his child. This is madness. But Richard only smirked, his voice cutting through the chaos. "If she can't survive a little cold, maybe she doesn't deserve to be my wife." The words landed like a slap across the entire town. For the first time, Grayford saw Richard not as a man of ambition, but as a monster. And as David wrapped his coat around Valentina and carried her away from the lake, a hush fell over the crowd. Everyone knew that nothing would ever be the same. Because that night, Richard Carter didn't just humiliate his wife. He humiliated himself. And Grayford would never forget. When David Collins carried Valentina away from the frozen lake, the crowd slowly dispersed, whispering in shock. Some shook their heads, others cursed Richard under their breath. But by the time Valentina was brought into David's home, wrapped in blankets and trembling violently, Grayford had returned to its silence. No one dared confront Richard directly. No one wanted to be the one who broke the town's unwritten rules. Valentina's body was ice. Her lips were blue, her skin pale as snow. David laid her gently on a couch near the fire, his hands moving quickly, almost frantically. He stripped away her soaked coat and boots, replaced them with dry blankets, and pressed hot compresses to her shivering arms. "Stay with me, Valentina," he urged, his voice steady though his heart pounded. "Don't close your eyes. You have to fight." Her teeth chattered violently, her breath shallow. "The baby," she whispered. Her hand clutched her belly as if shielding the child from death itself. "Please, save the baby." David swallowed hard, forcing back the lump in his throat. He was a doctor, trained to act, but in that moment he was also a man watching cruelty he could hardly comprehend. "I will," he promised softly. "But you have to save yourself first." The hours that followed blurred into a haze of fever and fear. Valentina's body burned with chills so severe her bones seemed to shake against each other. She drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes whispering prayers, sometimes crying out in confusion. At one point, her eyes fluttered open and she whispered, "Mama, are you here?" Her late mother's face appeared in her fevered dreams, standing at the edge of the room, whispering lullabies from Valentina's childhood. She reached out weakly, her hand trembling in the air, but touched only emptiness. David never left her side. He changed the compresses, measured her pulse, and checked the baby's heartbeat with trembling relief each time he heard its steady rhythm. Still, he knew the danger was not over. Hypothermia and pregnancy were a cruel combination. One wrong turn, and they could lose both mother and child. As night bled into morning, Valentina stirred awake with a ragged gasp. The fever had painted her cheeks crimson, her hair plastered damply to her forehead. Her voice was hoarse, almost broken. "Why, David? Why would he do this to me?" David's chest tightened. He wanted to tell her the truth, that Richard was a coward, a man who valued pride over love, but instead he said gently, "Because he doesn't see what you're worth, but I do, and so will others, once you find the strength to leave him." Tears welled in her eyes. "Leave? I have nothing. No money, no family. Where would I go? Who would take in a pregnant woman?" Her voice cracked with despair. I thought a husband was supposed to protect his wife." She turned her face into the pillow, sobs shaking her frail body. Every tear felt like it carved a scar deeper inside her. For the next several days, she lingered between sickness and exhaustion. David insisted she stay under his care, refusing to let her return to the cabin where Richard waited. When Richard came pounding on the door, demanding his wife back, David met him on the porch with steel in his voice. "She's not leaving this house until she's well," he said firmly. "And if you care about her child, you'll leave her be." Richard's glare burned hot enough to melt ice, but David stood his ground until he turned away. Still, Richard's threats lingered in the air like smoke. Inside, Valentina curled deeper into the blankets, her hands pressed protectively against her belly. The fever finally began to break, but the damage lingered in her spirit. She stared into the fire for hours, hollow-eyed, her thoughts circling endlessly. What if she lost the baby? What if Richard returned stronger and crueler? What if there was truly no escape? Her dreams turned dark. In one, she saw herself sinking beneath the ice again, unable to breathe, while Richard watched from the shore with folded arms. In another, she walked into the cabin only to find Vanessa seated in her chair, her hand on Richard's arm, her laughter echoing while Valentina was erased from existence. Each time she woke with a gasp, her chest heaving, she whispered, "I can't do this anymore." One evening, as snow tapped softly against the windows, Valentina sat upright on the couch, her face pale but her eyes burning with something different, fear mixed with determination. David was preparing tea when she finally spoke. "I can't go back to him," she whispered, almost as if she feared the walls would carry the confession to Richard's ears. David set the teapot down slowly. "Then don't." Her eyes filled with tears again. "It's not that simple. He'll find me, he'll take the baby. Her voice broke. "He'll finish what he started." David knelt in front of her, his voice steady. "Not if you fight back. You are stronger than you think, Valentina. He tried to drown you, but you're still here. That means something. That means you were meant to survive." His words pierced through the fog of despair, but fear still wrapped around her like chains. She lowered her gaze, whispering, "I don't know how." David took her trembling hand in his. "Then let me help you. You don't have to know everything right now. You just have to take the first step." Valentina stared at their joined hands, something flickering faintly in her chest, something that felt like hope, though fragile and small. But that fragile spark was nearly extinguished the next day. While David went to fetch medicine from the clinic, Valentina heard footsteps outside. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. The door rattled violently, then Richard's voice thundered through the walls. "Valentina, open this door. You're my wife, and you belong to me." Her hands clutched her belly as fear consumed her. He had come for her, just as she feared. And this time, she wasn't sure David would return before Richard forced his way in. The fire cracked loudly in the hearth as the pounding on the door grew harder. Valentina's heart raced. Her body was still weak, her fever barely gone. She knew if Richard dragged her back, she might never escape again. And then his voice came again, colder, sharper. "If you don't open this door, I swear, I'll make sure you regret it. You and that baby both." Valentina's breath hitched. She looked toward the window, toward the swirling snow outside. Every instinct screamed that she had only seconds to decide. Would she cower and let him drag her back into the cage? Or would she finally find the strength to resist? The pounding on David's door stopped only when the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the snow. A few neighbors, hearing Richard's shouts, had wandered close enough to make their presence known. Richard cursed under his breath, his pride unwilling to create another scandal so soon after the lake incident. He left with a final growl, his words lingering like smoke. "This isn't over." Inside, Valentina collapsed onto the couch, clutching her belly, tears streaking down her pale cheeks. Her body was weak, but her spirit was even weaker. She whispered to herself, rocking slightly, "He'll never let me go. I'm trapped." When David returned later that evening with medicine, he found her trembling, her eyes red and swollen. He crouched down in front of her, concern etched across his face. "Valentina, listen to me. You are not trapped. There's something you don't know." Her gaze flickered toward him, filled with confusion and desperation. "What do you mean? I have nothing, David. No money, no family, nowhere to go. He knows that. That's why he keeps me." David hesitated for a long moment, as though weighing the burden of what he was about to say. Then, with a steady breath, he revealed the truth. You're wrong. You're not alone. And you're not without resources. Your mother, she left you something. Valentina blinked, stunned. For a moment she thought she'd misheard him. My mother? But she died years ago. She had nothing, David. Just a small cottage, barely enough to keep us alive. David shook his head. That's what she wanted you to believe. But the truth is different. Before she passed, she came to me. She asked me to hold documents for you, to give them to you only when you truly needed them. I believe that time is now. Her heart pounded. Documents? What kind of documents? David stood and crossed the room to his desk. From the bottom drawer, he pulled out a weathered envelope, its edges worn with time. He brought it to her, placing it gently into her trembling hands. Open it. With shaky fingers, Valentina tore the seal. Inside were several papers, yellowed but carefully kept. Her eyes widened as she read. A deed, bank statements, a will. Her mother's will. The words swam before her eyes, difficult to comprehend through her shock. Her mother had left her not only the cottage she grew up in, but also a parcel of land just outside Greyford. Land her mother had quietly inherited from her own parents. Land that had recently risen in value because of development nearby. And in a bank account, untouched for years, sat a sum of money larger than anything Valentina had ever seen. Not millions, but enough to free her. Enough to build a life away from Richard. Enough to protect her baby. Her lips parted in disbelief. This can't be real. Why didn't she tell me? David's voice softened. She wanted to protect you. She worried that if Richard, or any man like him, knew about it, they'd use it against you. She told me to wait until the moment you had no other choice, until the moment you needed strength. Valentina's hands shook as tears blurred her vision. For the first time in years, the weight pressing on her chest lifted, if only slightly. She wasn't powerless. She wasn't penniless. She wasn't trapped. She had a way out. But as the flicker of hope began to warm her, fear returned just as quickly. Richard, if he finds out about this, he'll take it. He'll use it against me. He'll never let me leave. David's eyes hardened. Then we don't let him find out. You don't tell him. Not yet. You take this gift your mother left you, and you use it to free yourself. Valentina, this is your chance. This is your way out. Her breath trembled as she clutched the documents to her chest. A storm of emotions swirled inside her. Grief for the mother she missed so dearly, anger at Richard for everything he had stolen from her, fear of what might come next, and beneath it all, a growing ember of strength she thought she had lost forever. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay awake on the couch, staring into the fire, replaying David's words in her mind. Your mother left you strength. This is your way out. For the first time, she dared to imagine a different future. A small home filled with warmth, where no one raised their voice at her. A life where she taught again, where she raised her child in peace. A world where she wasn't owned by anyone, but free. The thought both terrified and exhilarated her. But hope is fragile, and danger lurked just outside the door. Because while Valentina whispered prayers of gratitude to her mother, Richard was already scheming. Vanessa had cornered him the day after the lake incident, her lips curling in disdain. You looked like a fool, Richard, she hissed. The whole town is whispering about you. If you can't control your wife without humiliating yourself, then maybe you're not the man I thought you were. Richard's pride burned like fire. In his arrogance, he swore he would not lose face. He convinced himself Valentina would come crawling back, that she had nowhere else to go. But the uncertainty gnawed at him. And men like Richard, when cornered, became dangerous. The next morning, while Valentina clutched her mother's will like a lifeline, Richard stood outside the Carter cabin, staring at the snow-covered roof. He lit a cigarette, his jaw clenched. If she thinks she can defy me, he muttered, smoke curling in the cold air, she has another thing coming. Back at David's house, Valentina finally drifted into uneasy sleep, her hand resting protectively on her belly. In her dreams, she heard her mother's voice again. Strength, my child, I left you strength. She woke with tears streaming down her face, but this time they weren't only tears of sorrow, they were tears of resolve. Her life had been built on silence and endurance. But now, with her mother's secret inheritance, she held the key to a different destiny. Still, fear lingered. Richard was unpredictable, and Vanessa's poisonous whispers only fed his rage. Valentina knew that if he ever discovered the truth about the inheritance, he would destroy her before letting her go. She pressed the papers to her chest, her heart pounding. For the first time, she had hope. For the first time, she had power. But power in secret is a dangerous thing. And as the wind howled outside David's window, Valentina could not shake the feeling that Richard was already moving closer, already plotting his next act of cruelty. She had strength now. But was it enough to survive the storm about to come? For days, Valentina held the papers close, rereading her mother's will and bank statements over and over, as if the words might vanish if she blinked too long. Each time she felt the same dizzying mix of disbelief and relief. She wasn't powerless. She wasn't trapped. There was a future waiting for her. A future Richard could no longer control. But knowing she had strength and learning to use it were two very different things. At first, she remained cautious, hiding the inheritance as if even the walls might betray her secret. She tucked the envelope under the floorboard in David's study, where Richard's eyes could never find it. Each night she whispered to her unborn child, "We have hope now. We will be free." Her body slowly recovered from the shock of the icy lake. The fever faded, her strength returned, and with it came something unexpected. A fire. Each morning as she washed her face and looked into the mirror, she no longer saw only fear staring back. She saw someone who had survived what should have killed her. She saw a woman who had endured humiliation, pain, and betrayal, and was still standing. It began with small changes. She brushed her hair differently, tying it back with purpose instead of letting it hang limply around her shoulders. She walked with straighter posture, her hand resting on her belly with pride rather than shame. She began to speak more, not in whispers, but in steady words. David noticed immediately. "You're different," he said one morning as he poured her a cup of tea. Valentina smiled faintly. "I'm tired of being silent." And then, one evening, she did something that surprised even herself. She left David's home alone and walked into Grayford. Heads turned as she entered the small tailor's shop. The townsfolk hadn't seen her in weeks, not since the scandal at the lake. Whispers buzzed like bees as she passed. Some pitied her, others judged her, but Valentina ignored them all. Inside the shop, she asked for a gown. Not a lavish one, but one that fit her changing body, one that made her feel like more than just the poor wife of Richard Carter. She chose a dark green fabric that clung softly to her figure, accentuating her strength instead of hiding it. When she saw herself in the mirror for the first time in years, she felt a flicker of pride. The transformation was not just in her clothing, it was in her eyes. The woman who had walked into that shop looked timid and broken. The woman who walked out looked like someone who carried secrets too heavy for the town to guess. Word spread quickly. "Did you see her? Valentina Carter, walking through town as if nothing had happened." She looked different, stronger. Richard's wife? No, she's not the same woman anymore. Richard himself soon heard the whispers. At first he laughed. "She's pretending," he scoffed to Vanessa. "She has nothing without me." But even he felt a twinge of unease. For the first time, the town wasn't whispering about his charm or ambition. They were whispering about her. Meanwhile, Valentina began to plan. She visited the bank in secret, escorted by David to avoid Richard's watchful eyes. There, the manager confirmed what the papers revealed. The money was real, the land was hers, and no one, not even Richard, could touch it. With David's help, she began to draft plans for her future. A new home, away from the cabin that had become her prison. A safe nursery for her child. And perhaps one day, a school of her own, where no child in Grayford would feel as powerless as she once had. But transformation is never without fear. At night, Richard's voice still echoed in her dreams, reminding her of the danger. She knew he would not give up easily. His pride was too great, his rage too deep. And so, she armored herself, not just with money and plans, but with courage. One afternoon, standing before the mirror in her new gown, she spoke aloud, not to Richard, but to herself. "You are not weak. You are not worthless. You are Valentina Carter, and you will never be his possession again." David heard her from the doorway, a quiet smile tugging at his lips. "That's the woman I always knew you were." Her transformation did not go unnoticed. Invitations began to arrive, small gatherings, town meetings, places she had once been excluded from because Richard controlled the narrative. This time, she accepted. She attended with her head held high, speaking with quiet confidence, proving to the community that she was not the broken woman Richard wanted them to see. And slowly, the town began to shift. Whispers turned into support. People began to question Richard's cruelty, to murmur that perhaps they had been wrong to stay silent. It all built toward one night, the annual Winter Gala, the most prestigious event in Greyford. Richard planned to attend with Vanessa on his arm, expecting to parade her as proof of his power. But Valentina had other plans. The day before the gala, she stood before David, her green gown ready, her hair styled with careful grace. "I'm going," she said firmly. David frowned. "It's dangerous. Richard will be there. He'll try to humiliate you again." Her eyes burned with determination. "No. This time, I will humiliate him. I've hidden long enough. Tomorrow night, the whole town will see who Richard truly is, and they will see who I have become." David studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then I'll be by your side." Valentina's heart raced with fear and anticipation. The gala would be her stage, the moment where she stepped fully into her new self. She no longer wanted just to survive, she wanted justice. That night, as she lay in bed, she whispered once more to her unborn child, "Tomorrow, everything changes. Tomorrow we show the world we are not weak." But outside, in the icy streets of Greyford, Richard Carter was already planning his own performance. He boasted to Vanessa, "Tomorrow, she'll learn who really holds the power. She'll regret ever defying me." Neither of them knew that the gala would not end as either expected. Because in the glittering lights of that winter ballroom, truth would collide with arrogance, and the woman Richard thought he destroyed would rise from the ashes. And when Valentina walked through those doors, the entire town would finally see that the real power was hers. The night of the Winter Gala arrived like a storm, wrapped in velvet. Greyford's Grand Hall, normally used for town meetings and weddings, had been transformed into a glittering palace of light. Chandeliers dripped crystal tears onto polished wooden floors, while a string quartet filled the air with music that was both haunting and regal. The town's elite had gathered, wrapped in furs and silks, their laughter echoing beneath the high ceilings. It was the one night of the year when appearances mattered more than truth. And for Richard Carter, appearances were everything. He arrived with Vanessa Moore draped on his arm, her gown a bold scarlet that screamed defiance. She glittered with diamonds, her smile sharp as a knife. Richard, dressed in a black tailored suit, wore the smug confidence of a man who believed he had already won. He paraded Vanessa through the hall, shaking hands, accepting congratulations, ignoring the whispers that still lingered from the scandal at the lake. "Look at him," one woman muttered to her husband, "as if nothing happened." "But people haven't forgotten," her husband replied grimly. "Not after what he did to Valentina." Yet Richard basked in the attention, convinced his charm was stronger than memory. He laughed loudly, boasted about business ventures, and whispered promises into Vanessa's ear. "Tonight, they'll forget all about her," he said. "Tonight, it's us they'll talk about." But then the doors opened, and Valentina walked in. The room fell silent, as if the music itself bowed to her entrance. She wore the deep green gown she had chosen, her hair swept elegantly back, her posture regal. Her hand rested gently on her swollen belly, not as a burden, but as a crown. She walked slowly, each step measured, her eyes forward, her expression calm and unshaken. She did not look like the broken woman who had fallen through the ice. She looked like a queen returning to reclaim her throne. Gasps rippled through the crowd. "Is that Valentina? She looks radiant. She shouldn't even be here after what happened." Richard froze, his smirk faltering for the first time. His hand tightened on Vanessa's arm, but she felt it, his unease. He tried to cover it with a laugh. Well, the ghost returns," he muttered, forcing a grin. Valentina moved through the crowd, people parting for her without realizing it. She nodded politely, her eyes locking on Richard with quiet fire. When she reached the center of the hall, she paused, turning to face the crowd. "Good evening," she said, her voice clear, ringing against the marble walls. Every eye was on her. "I wasn't sure I would ever stand here again," she continued. But sometimes fate brings you back to the very place where you were broken, so you can show the world you were never truly destroyed. Murmurs spread. Richard's face reddened, his jaw tightening. Valentina, that's enough, he snapped. Go home. You're embarrassing yourself. But she didn't flinch. She looked directly at him, her voice cutting through his like a blade. No, Richard. Tonight the only person embarrassing themselves is you. The crowd erupted in whispers, some gasping audibly. Richard stepped forward, trying to tower over her, but she held her ground. You think you can humiliate me here? He hissed. You think these people care? Valentina's lips curved into a faint smile. I don't need to humiliate you, Richard. You did that yourself, when you pushed your pregnant wife into a frozen lake. The words rang like a bell, silencing the hall. All eyes turned to Richard. Gasps echoed. Vanessa's smile faltered, her fingers twitching nervously on his sleeve. Richard laughed weakly, though sweat glistened on his temple. She's lying. She exaggerates. You all know how dramatic she is. But David Collins stepped forward from the crowd. She's not lying. I pulled her out myself. I saw it. We all did. The room erupted. Shocked voices clashed like thunder. It's true? He nearly killed her. A man like that has no honor. Richard's composure cracked. He raised his voice, desperate. Enough. She's my wife. She belongs to me. What happens between us is no one else's business. But Valentina's voice rose higher, stronger. I don't belong to you. Not anymore. I belong to myself, and to the child you tried to destroy. She reached into her purse, pulling out the documents her mother had left her. She held them high, her voice ringing with power. And let the town know this. I am not penniless. I am not weak. I am the heir to land and wealth my mother entrusted to me. I am not the poor, broken woman you wanted me to be, Richard. I am free. The crowd gasped again, but this time it wasn't in pity, it was in awe. The broken wife they had pitied was gone. In her place stood a woman of strength, a woman with power. Richard's face twisted with rage. He lunged toward her, his hand outstretched as if to snatch the papers away. But before he could reach her, David stepped between them, his hand gripping Richard's wrist with iron strength. Touch her again, David growled, and I swear you'll regret it. The hall erupted into chaos. Some tried to calm the scene, others shouted in anger. Vanessa slipped quietly from Richard's side, her eyes wide with fear. The man she had admired now looked pathetic, cornered, undone. Valentina lifted her chin, her voice steady despite the storm. This is who you are, Richard. A man who tries to break women because he is too weak to face himself. But tonight, everyone sees the truth. Richard's eyes blazed, his pride collapsing under the weight of humiliation. For the first time, he looked small, and as the crowd closed in around him, their whispers sharp as knives, Valentina turned and walked away, her gown trailing behind her like a banner of victory. But as she left the hall, one thought pierced her triumph like a shard of ice. Richard Carter was not a man who accepted defeat quietly, and she knew, deep in her bones, that his vengeance was only just beginning. The winter gala ended in chaos. By the time Valentina stepped outside into the cold night, the hall behind her buzzed with scandal. Richard Carter's name was no longer spoken with admiration, but with disgust. People who once turned away from his cruelty now whispered openly, "Monster. Coward. He doesn't deserve her." Valentina wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, the night air crisp but somehow no longer suffocating. For the first time in years, she felt the weight on her chest begin to lift. She had stood up to him, not in secret whispers or tears, but in front of everyone. And Grayford had seen the truth. But as she walked down the snowy street with David by her side, she knew Richard would not go quietly. His pride was too deep, his hunger for control too fierce. She was right. The very next morning, Richard stormed into the bank. His face was pale, his jaw clenched. He demanded to see Valentina's accounts, shouting about marital rights and property laws. But the bank manager, a man who had once cowered in his presence, calmly shook his head. "The accounts are in her name alone, Mr. Carter. You have no claim." Richard's rage boiled over. He smashed his fist onto the counter, shouting curses that echoed through the building. But it was useless. His power was crumbling. Word spread quickly. Within days, business partners began to distance themselves. Investors pulled out. Even Vanessa, sensing his collapse, vanished without a word. Richard found himself standing alone, his empire of arrogance dissolving like snow under the spring sun. Meanwhile, Valentina's life began to bloom. She used part of her inheritance to purchase a small but warm home near the heart of Greyford, far from the cabin that had imprisoned her. She filled it with light, fresh curtains, a crib painted in soft colors, shelves lined with children's books. For the first time, she could breathe without fear. When the baby finally came, a healthy, crying boy with dark hair and bright eyes, she wept tears of pure relief. She named him Gabriel, after the angel who brings messages of hope. Holding him against her chest, she whispered, "You'll never know the pain I knew. You'll grow in love, not fear." David stood by her side through it all, not as a savior, but as a steady presence, a reminder that not all men wielded love as a weapon. His support was quiet, never demanding, always respectful. And though Valentina's heart was still fragile, she began to imagine a life where trust and companionship could exist again. Not built on control, but on choice. The town, too, began to change. Greyford could no longer ignore what it had witnessed. Women whispered to Valentina in the market, thanking her for her courage, confessing their own silent struggles. Men who once looked down on her now nodded in respect. Children ran to her with laughter, asking when she would teach again. And she did. With part of her inheritance, Valentina opened a small schoolhouse, brighter and warmer than the old one where she had once taught. "For every child who needs a voice," she told the townsfolk at the ribbon cutting, "for every woman who thinks she has none." Her transformation became more than personal. It became a beacon. But Richard, stripped of wealth, respect, and love, spiraled deeper into bitterness. One cold morning, he stood outside Valentina's new school, watching from a distance as she carried Gabriel inside, surrounded by children and laughter. He looked gaunt, his once proud shoulders hunched. He shouted her name, demanding she speak to him. Valentina stepped outside, her son cradled in her arms. The townsfolk gathered, curious but wary. "What do you want, Richard?" Her voice was calm, steady, no longer trembling. His eyes burned with desperation. "I made a mistake. I was wrong. Take me back, Valentina, please. We can fix this. I'll be better. I'll change." For a moment, silence stretched across the street. Everyone waited, holding their breath. Then Valentina shook her head slowly. "No, Richard, you don't get to break me and then beg to rebuild me. I am not your possession. I never was, and I never will be again." Her words echoed like thunder. Richard's face crumbled, the last of his pride shattering. He fell to his knees in the snow, sobbing, but Valentina turned away. She walked back into the school, her son nestled safely against her heart, leaving him behind with nothing but his regret. That day, Greyford saw more than Richard's downfall. They saw a woman rise from the ashes of humiliation to claim her dignity, her power, her future. In the weeks that followed, Valentina continued to heal. She built a life filled with love, community, and purpose. She still carried scars, memories of ice, fear, and betrayal, but those scars no longer defined her. They were proof of survival, proof of strength. One evening, as she sat rocking Gabriel to sleep by the fire, she whispered softly, "We made it, my love. We're free." The baby cooed, his tiny fingers wrapping around hers. Tears filled her eyes, but this time they were not tears of despair. They were tears of gratitude. She thought of her mother, of the inheritance that had come not just in money, but in wisdom. "Strength, my child. I left you strength." And she knew she had honored that gift. The story of Valentina Carter spread far beyond Greyford. Women in nearby towns heard whispers of the teacher who defied her cruel husband, of the woman who turned humiliation into power. Her name became a symbol, her story a reminder. Silence does not mean weakness. Endurance does not mean defeat. And though Richard remained in Greyford, a shadow of the man he once was, his name carried no weight anymore. He had lost everything he thought made him powerful. Valentina had lost him, and gained herself. In the end, her message was clear, not only to Greyford, but to every woman who ever felt trapped, voiceless, or broken. A woman is never weak because she loves. She is only weak when she forgets to love herself first. And when she remembers, no one, not even the cruelest man, can take her power away. The fire in her eyes told the rest of the story. Valentina Carter was no victim. She was a survivor. She was a mother. She was free, and her new life was only just beginning.